Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session all about motivation and the science of learning. I hope you find this useful with all of your teaching, and especially in preparation for your grade 9 academic pathways courses. Warning. To learn the most from this presentation, you should watch it with colleagues. So to do this, create a Zoom meeting and invite your teaching colleagues to it, even if you can just get one person. Have one person play the video and then share their screen with everybody else. Then pause the video whenever you'd like to talk about an idea or anything that interests people. And then please contact me if you would like to have further discussions or sign up for one of our discussion sessions that focuses on each of these presentations. So what motivates students to learn? This is the focus of our session today. Is it the exciting demonstrations that we do in our science classrooms? Is it when we stand on the table and wax eloquent about the beauty of science? Well, our goal is for our students to form a strong, positive emotional connection between themselves and their learning. This is what we want to have happen. Now, our solution for doing this is creating a learning experience for our students that matches how the human brain works. So to figure this out, we're going to take a careful look at how that brain does its job. So how does the brain work? Well, there's 4 basic mechanisms or things that our brain does in order to survive. Let's take a look at these. The first one is control its body. Our brain is desperate to exercise control over its body, especially after it figures out how to do that. It wants to be able to choose how to use its body. An important job for our brain is to avoid danger, a critical component of survival. And our brain is always seeking pleasure, just like this monkey swiping somebody's booze off the beach. And our brain is hardwired to understand its environment. I always find it easiest to understand how humans work by looking at babies and monkeys. Now, because all of these mechanisms in our brain are so important for survival, they trigger very strong emotional responses. And this is critical for us to understand as teachers because we want to be able to take advantage of the positive emotions and help our students manage the negative ones. So let's focus on cognition, thinking, and emotion. We might think that there is a clear division between these 2 facets of the human brain, but this really is just fiction. Cognition and emotion are very messily entwined, perhaps with ripped shirts. One of the reasons for this is the structures of our brain associated with emotion are some of the oldest in the mammalian brain. They're very deep inside the brain and they are wired to everything else. So emotion affects our ability to think. It affects our cognitive processes. In particular, there's one structure here that I'll point out called the hippocampus. Emotion is really needed for us to learn because our brains, as part of our survival mechanism, have evolved in a way to encode the memories that are the most significant to us. And that significance is given by our emotional responses to those situations. So if there's little emotional response, then those memories are not going to be encoded from short to long-term memory. So emotion is a critical part of all learning. And learning will be better, more long-lasting and secure if it's associated with good, positive emotions. Now let's take a look at those mechanisms that we mentioned at the start. So one of those is understanding our environment, critical to our survival as organisms. If we take a look at how our brain does that, we can break it down roughly into 4 steps or processes. There's the back part of our brain that takes the sensory inputs from our body, and then it sends its signals to the section of our brain, roughly at the sides, where we assign meaning to these inputs, to these sensory signals. So when we see something, we say, oh, okay, that's a chair. Oh, that's the teacher. Then the signals go from that section to the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. This is where we do our abstract reasoning, our thinking, and our planning. So we put together all of these things that have been input into our minds. And then the signals head to the top part of our brain, which is our motor cortex. So the plan gets transmitted to the part of the brain that controls the body. And now the body executes that plan. This forms a rough cycle. This is greatly simplified, of course. It gives us an important schematic to follow when we try to understand how people learn. This process is deeply hardwired into our brains, and it's a cycle, so it happens over and over and over again. This is such an important idea that we'll give it a special name. We'll call it the cognitive learning cycle. Now, earlier on in the presentation, we talked about how our teaching needs to match how our brains work and how they learn. So here's our first test of that. Let's think of traditional teaching and compare that with the cognitive learning cycle. In a traditional class, the teacher tends to explain a fair bit of stuff, especially at the start. So the students experience a lot of input. Now, the next stage in the cognitive learning cycle is where we assign meaning. But our lessons tend to skip over this, or at least they don't allow an opportunity for this until maybe 30 minutes toward the end of the lesson itself. So there's little opportunity for the students to reflect on that input and assign meaning to it. Now, once our lesson is done and it's time for the students to do their work, they often end up doing a couple of things. It might involve moving information around. So for example, writing down definitions from the textbook, or maybe you're copying a diagram from the textbook, or you might be doing a bunch of math. And these processes can take place largely in the prefrontal cortex without much of the cognitive learning cycle happening. And so if that's where the student's work finishes off, then they've had very little opportunity to actively test the plans, the information that they've been processing it. And active testing takes place in the motor cortex, so it requires some sort of physical movement in response to the plans that they're making. So what would improved teaching look like? Well, first of all, we have to pace the content to match the student's learning cycle. If it's any faster than what their cycle can handle, then the students will become discouraged because their brains are hardwired to go through that process. And they want to do it constantly, not at the end of 30 minutes, not at the end of 15 minutes. They need to do it continuously in order to make sense of the inputs they are receiving. And if they don't have an opportunity to do that, it becomes very discouraging. Now, I want to highlight something important that happens in all of our classes, and that is what I call the learning game. So when the learning cycle is not allowed to work properly inside the student's brain to go through the complete cycles, very often, students switch to a different kind of learning strategy, which I call the learning game. So what they do is this. In their minds, without realizing it, they're saying something kind of like this. I know I'm not going to learn, right? They can sense that that learning cycle is not happening and they're getting frustrated. But I will jump through your hoops and get what I can out of this experience, meaning being in your class, and that is marks. So the students, in a sense, know they're not learning, but if you ask them to repeat terms on a quiz or a test, they'll do it. If you ask them to move these symbols around and draw these diagrams, they'll do it. But they're understanding very little of what they are doing. Now, there's another strategy that some students take. Some choose not to play the learning game, and in fact, they disconnect from your learning process in the classroom. This is an entirely reasonable response. when their brains experience this inability to go through the cognitive learning cycle. So we can hardly blame them for that choice. This is a good spot to pause the video. So please pause it here and have a discussion with your colleagues. There's a few questions that I've provided to prompt your discussions, but feel free to talk about whatever you find is helpful. So take a moment to reflect on the cognitive learning cycle and this idea of the learning game. And then when you're ready, you can unpause and continue. There's a really helpful bonus that comes from the learning cycle, and it's based on this testing stage within it. That obligation to test the abstract ideas that we're planning and that we're processing in our prefrontal cortex requires a physically meaningful test. And when that happens, when the students do something meaningful with that new knowledge or the new ideas that they're working with, they see the results of that. So that goes into the input of their brain. They assign meaning to those results. Oh, we got it. Excellent. Something really remarkable happens. So there are structures deep within the brain that reward us for successfully understanding our environment. So a flood of dopamine reaches especially parts in the prefrontal cortex, because that's where you're doing the heavy lifting of figuring stuff out. Now, teachers know this experience very well. That's the little shot of happiness that you get when, oh, you figure something out. Oh, it makes sense. And sometimes we see this in our students, but we want this to be a very regular experience. And we're lucky as science teachers, because if we think of how science works and how do we determine whether scientific ideas work, it's through experimental tests, doing physical things. So one of the most important facets of science and learning science turns out to mesh perfectly with how our students' brains work. That requirement to test, to physically do things, to see if your understanding works or is reliable. So we're really fortunate for that in our science teaching. Now, let me give you some example of physically meaningful tasks from my grade 9 science course. These tasks are best when students can try them out and decide for themselves without the teacher's intervention whether or not they got it right. So for example, they could predict the mass that you put on a floating cardboard boat, the maximum mass that it can carry. And then you test it out. Or you can have some mystery elements and you have to make some measurements and describe their physical properties and try to figure out which element that is. And then you get to check. You can rub different objects together and then make a prediction. Okay, how will these objects interact? And then you try it and you do it and you see. Or you can notice the strange bubbling coming from yeast. And you can put together some experiments to determine what process is producing those bubbles. Now, also good as physically meaningful tests are when you compare your work and ideas with exemplars that the teacher might provide, or with your peers in the class. This can be through written work or just a discussion. Because if you're saying things to your neighbors in your group, you are moving your mouth. That's a physical process. And it's triggering that next stage in the cognitive learning cycle. And then when the other people in the group agree with you, you go, oh, okay, yeah, we figured it out. And you're completing that loop and it continues. So there are lots of things that can qualify as the physically meaningful tests, but it's really helpful if it's not the teacher who's saying, yes, that idea is right. Okay, next. So all of this is connected to that pleasure-seeking part of our brain, because this is a powerful force of motivation. And those examples that I just listed are powerful experiences for our students. And when learning produces pleasurable results, we hope that encourages more learning, as just like those monkeys on the beach, students are looking for that next hit of pleasure. Now, the next idea that we'll take a look at is control over the body. Now, let's think about the traditional classroom and how control is dealt with. So the movement of students, they pretty much have to face the front the whole time. We want them to sit still and to write down what they see being written. In terms of conversation, there's very little personal talking that's allowed. And so students need to wait to be called upon to talk about the things that the teacher wants them to talk about. And as far as the ideas that are being discussed, well, it's the teacher's ideas. Those are the important ones, or the good ones. And students' ideas, well, you might get to them later, maybe at the end of class. Now, the problem with this traditional model of control over the body is that student actions have very little effect on their environment, which is your lesson. And that is, unless they are disruptive actions. So sometimes the need of the brain to control the body and change its environment is so great that students feel this need to act disruptively. And that's because their other actions have almost no effect on the course of the lesson. So let's take a look at a different model of control for the classroom. Here's a quick peek at my own class. So in that very short clip, for movement, students are welcome to move around whenever they like. We didn't happen to see them in that example, but if you need to stretch your legs, you get up, you stretch your legs. If you need to sharpen your pencil, you just get up and you sharpen your pencil. So there's much more control that the students have of their bodies. As far as conversation goes, the students are talking at will based on, well, whatever they like. And a certain amount of that is desirable because we're social creatures and we need to talk about stuff. Now, the majority of what they talk about is, in fact, science, which we train them to do. Now, for the ideas, these are guided by the questions that I give them, but they're really following their own course of thoughts through those questions. And so that has a very different feeling of control. And most importantly, it's those student conversations that guide the teacher and control the lesson as a whole. So this new model of control has different standards of classroom behavior. Now, these standards must be very high. And so we carefully train the students at the beginning of the course in terms of these standards and the desired behaviors. And we regularly remind and reinforce them of these expectations. If you try to change that model of control without training in high standards of behavior, you get disaster. When students essentially start doing their own thing, and you're left with a very unproductive learning environment. So let's think about what's happening here. As we're reducing the amount of direct control teacher has over many aspects of what the students are doing, something else really important starts to happen. In this carefully structured environment, the student ownership of learning starts to increase. This is a really important result of decreasing the teacher control in a very structured way. And at the same time, the amount of off-task behavior decreases. And the amount of time students spend productively learning increases quite a bit. And because of that, I'm not worried if students spend a few minutes here or there just chatting about whatever, because they're spending so much of the rest of the class time doing productive, useful things. At the end of our first test in grade 9 science, when we finished the electricity unit, I always asked my students this one question. In our science class, we learn in a different way than many other classes. What aspect of learning in our grade 9 science class helped you the most? Please explain. And here are some of the responses from my students.
The fact that we got to move around and do experiments and not always be writing down things. In other classes, the teacher may just show a bunch of slides with information we have to copy down, or the teacher might just tell us to read from a textbook, but I find I lose interest easily.
Please pause the video here. This is another good opportunity to have a chat with your colleagues. So take some time to talk about the traditional model of control in the classroom and the new model. And then when you're ready, you can start the video again. Now, one final thought about these models of control. In my own class, I would say that I spend about 80% of the time using that newer model with the clear student focus. But about 20% is the traditional of where I want you facing the front, I want you quiet, and I want you listening to the teacher. Now, each of these works because it serves a clear purpose in the learning process of the students. And the students appreciate this, as can be seen from these comments.
Doing hands-on experiments in groups really helped me as we got to see it, discuss, and figure things out for ourselves, which is a really important skill needed by all scientists. Also, class discussions really helped clear up confusion or wrong answers. Our class discussion after each activity are groups.
The rebellion will continue to gain support in the Imperial Senate.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us.
How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
The regional governors now have direct control over their territories. Fear will keep the local systems in line.
Fear is a powerful motivator, and it often is manifest in terms of the response in our bodies by anxiety. This happens an awful lot in connection with mathematics and with testing. And it's important for us to understand how this is happening or the processes involved in our brain. Our brain starts off with some inputs, and it sends those signals to one of those structures that I hinted at earlier on, these ancient structures in our brain. This one is called the amygdala. So its job is to check the inputs that we're receiving and decide if any are truly threatening, if something serious needs to be done about it. And then it sends signals to the decision-making part of our brain to help us do that. Now, the amygdala takes its job very seriously. So it doesn't slack off, and it's always looking for anything that might be a threat to the organism. So if the students hear that there's a science test coming up, there's the input, goes to the amygdala, and then the amygdala it's concerned about this. It sends signals to the front part of your brain saying that, oh, this is a threatening experience. And so your brain starts to think things kind of like this. I'm not doing well. I'm going to fail. And it often triggers avoidance behaviors. This is something we have to watch out for carefully as teachers. So our amygdala causes us to focus on the negative aspects of that input, and also to forget the positive aspects that can be associated with it. So even for students who traditionally do very well on things like tests, the amygdala causes us to forget that and to focus on the negative parts. So even those students can experience a lot of anxiety associated with testing. Now, originally, the amygdala evolved to help protect us from grievous threats. So if you think of our Ice Age ancestors, and we see an input, a saber-toothed tiger coming at us, that's going to send a signal to the amygdala. The amygdala doesn't wait for the prefrontal cortex to do anything. It just sends the signals to the brainstem to get the heck out of there. And so it's entirely reasonable that our forebears would not focus on their science work when there was a clear and present threat. Because the amygdala takes its job so seriously, and because human beings are very complex organisms, we associate risks and possible threats with many different things. You can have a clear physical risk to the body, but there's also social risks, risks of how our peers perceive us. And we have self-esteem risks or threats to how we perceive ourselves. So any of these can trigger the amygdala and start these negative associations with whatever that input was. And typically in learning, one of the greatest fears is the fear of making mistakes. First of all, making mistakes in front of the class. This can be terrifying for students, and really nobody likes that kind of experience. So it's important as teachers that we genuinely value mistakes. And so we don't just pay lip service to it, but we really emphasize how we can benefit from making mistakes and helping other people learn from them. Now, if you think about how science works, an important aspect of science is testing all the plausible ideas that could explain some phenomenon. And in fact, in science, it's a considerable error to converge too quickly on the one right answer, because it's kind of your job to test all these alternatives. So when we make mistakes, that's actually a really important part of the scientific process, because that mistake represents an alternative idea, and these ideas are all equally valid, at least until science starts to test them and decide which is the most reliable. Something else that can help an awful lot is if, when students speak in front of the class, what they're sharing are the group's ideas rather than their own personal ideas. So this helps to decrease that sense of risk. Now, it can also be scary to make mistakes in front of your peer groups, the small groups that students might be working in. So it's really important to train our students to discuss the ideas in a very thoughtful way without being judgmental of one another, just to understand that it's totally natural and normal to make mistakes as you're sorting out these scientific ideas. The important thing is that we learn from them and we're constantly improving our understanding. So we want to take the negative connotations away from making mistakes, and that requires training and reminding. It's also important to value and ask for crazy ideas when you are coming up with ideas or responses to a question. So it's okay just to throw ideas out there, and then you can do the careful thinking process of deciding which of these ideas is the most useful. So don't worry about being judgmental right away. Now, here's what some of my students say about making mistakes.
What helped me most in grade 9 science is working in groups and the way Mr. Meyer teaches us, also working hands-on and getting a chance to correct our mistakes. I think working in groups helped the most because I got to hear other people's perspectives, and they could help me when I'm wrong.
Making mistakes on assessment often leads to a lot of anxiety. So as teachers, we can help to mitigate that by changing the nature of our assessments. One way of doing that is by having opportunities to improve upon the work in an assessment. So it could be the daily work that students might hand in, or things like quizzes and tests. If there's an opportunity to improve, then you're turning that assessment into a genuine learning opportunity. Please pause the video here. This is a great chance for you to discuss this aspect in learning of fear. There is another fear associated with learning, and that is the fear of not belonging, the fear of being the odd kid out in the class, or that you'll be seen by the others in the class as not belonging, that you will not be perceived as a valued member of the group, or that you will perceive yourself as not being able to keep up with the rest of the group. This is a really important topic, and in fact, I'm going to devote a whole other session to this. So please join me for that session. So let's recap some of the ideas that we've taken a look at in this presentation. So what is motivating? Well, what is not? Let's start with that.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government.
What is not motivating? Well, it's listening to someone go on and on about something you didn't choose. Now, I'm hoping you chose to watch this video. Now, what is motivating? Building your own understanding and listening to others when they have that missing piece It could be your teacher, it could be your peers in your discussion group. But when you have that ownership of your understanding, it totally changes the mental framework that our students are working in, and it becomes a motivating experience. And this is the most important point from this whole presentation, and that is good pedagogy is intrinsically motivating. And so we need to design our lessons around students and their learning needs. And to do that well, we have to understand how their brains work. And here's another response from my own students.
What helped me most in grade 9 science is the fact that you let us do new and fun experiments that we wouldn't be able to do without a lab. Makes the learning so much more fun than all my other science classes. I hope you come up with some interesting ones for chemistry.
So as a quick summary, what are some sources of motivation? Social interactions are a powerful, motivating experience. We are social creatures. We're hardwired to chat with our neighbors. And if we could take advantage of this in a positive way to learn science, then we're off to the races. Building one's personal understanding of an idea is very motivating, much more so than listening to another person share their understanding. That's motivating for the other person, but not so much for the person who's trying to figure things out for the first time. Experiences that reinforce what we think we know is very powerful. I mentioned these earlier on, that physically meaningful test. When you think this is what's going to happen when you bring these charged objects together, and you're not sure, but maybe, and then you do it and you see it and you go, oh, okay, yeah, that worked. Oh, right. This is the exact same mechanism which is happening in our social media networks when people are thinking, oh, maybe there's these strange things going on in the government, and then they see a post by somebody else and then they realize, oh yeah, there are these strange conspiracies happening, and that gets reinforced. Well, here we can use that same mechanism in a positive way for learning science. And finally, meaningful tasks are a powerful source of motivation. And by that, I mean tasks that require thought and discussion between a group of people, that encourages those social interactions and makes sure that the task is not trivial. And tasks that are meaningful also connect to things around them. It's one thing to draw diagrams on a board of charged objects and describe how they're interacting, but it's really quite different to be talking about that pop can and the plastic rod you have right in front of you, and you're discussing, predicting, and then testing what's going to happen. That is a meaningful experience. So once we understand what motivation is all about in our science classes, then we can really enjoy the exciting demonstrations. We can get our students all riled up and have lots of fun. We can get on top of our tables and wax eloquent about all sorts of our favorite science topics. But what's most important is that our main focus is on good pedagogy for motivating our students. Once we've got that, then we can really enjoy these other ways of helping our students emotionally connect to our science classes. So thank you for joining me for this presentation, but we're not quite done. I want you to continue your discussions here with your colleagues. And I hope that you'll check out some of the other presentations that I have available and join me for some of my discussion sessions. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found this helpful.